This week, we want to have a look at social justice and equity. This is the final week of our units, and we put this here at the end when we've had a bit of a think about some issues that are going on in education. Some of the things that we know relate to unequal outcomes in education, relate to social consequences, and so forth. And we've been looking at those in a little bit of a theoretical sense and a bit of a pragmatic sense of here's some evidence, and thinking about them in terms of what we can do in relation to schooling. At the end, we want to throw a bit of theory and philosophy in, because we want to start thinking about, well, actually, what is just and right and good and equitable? What do these things actually mean? Because one of the biggest dilemmas we have in this sort of work is that our judgments are based on these interpretations that are essentially ideological. So if we go back to the very first week, we started off with ideologies in education and philosophies and where they come from a philosophical social political point of view. So we're going to finish up there again in relation to these terms. The key thing is that social justice and equity are much used, but they're not often discussed in terms of what their meanings are. And the thing is, people are going to have different views. We have a Liberal and a Labor Party or a Conservative and Social Democratic Party in most of our political systems. And this is because people in society sit on one side of the fence or another, and they then interpret political events and decisions through those lenses. Key things we want to point out here are things like equity tends to be more of an adjective or a noun for primarily economic type notions when we look at it in terms of the literature. So they're linked to capacity for social opportunities and so forth. But given that they're around the distribution of those opportunities, they use an economic language. Social justice is more of a verb linked to notions of social change. Okay, so equity tends to measure what the outcome is, largely speaking. Social justice tends to think about the process more. Of course, the ideologies are run deep, and we're not going to change those. I think we can look back in the philosophical lens, and the Platonian and Aristotelian views are sort of pretty much good starting points. So you've got that view about what's right, good, and desirable that comes from Plato, and you've got that view about what's fair and how we describe fair and distribute social goods coming from Aristotle. So the notion of what is right, good, and desirable and what is fair are two concepts to keep in mind. Now, I would expect in any school staff room, when you're looking at your excursion policy and who gets to go and who doesn't, or your discipline policy and what punishments will be meted out, or behaviour modifications, or what resourcing you'll give to what classes, you'll have debates around these very notions, and you won't get agreement. Okay, but to understand where people are coming from in that sense maybe helps have a more informed debate. In a theoretical sense, there's this overview of social justice. Now, this is outlined in the notes on social justice theory that you've got there in your on your Moodle site, and there's some notes that we wrote earlier and revised last year. In there, I sort of describe social justice around some of its traditions and theories. So, in this diagram, we have a brief summary, and those summaries are then described in that document. On the right-hand side, we have the major approach to social justice. It's about distributing something. Okay, so we raise taxes. Taxes then pay for a whole lot of government services and resources. In education, they pay for the buildings, wages, resources, and so forth. But we tend to then decide in our social policies, well, we have these taxes, how are we going to spend them, who's going to get the benefits of these? And we then distribute things on that basis. Now, there's two ways we do that. One is social democratic, one is a liberal market individualistic. And if you think about politics, basically social democratic tends to be more social progressive, left of politics. Liberal market tends to be more the right of politics. So the liberal market one is basically everyone should get something because everyone has contributed. And then we give people opportunities and they make the most of them or they don't, and that's their responsibility. The social democratic approach is more that we should give more to those who need it more and need greater support. I like to think about it in terms of, say, a soccer team. Okay, you've got a bunch of kids, never played soccer in their lives. So you kit them all out in soccer gear, throw them on the field and say, look, you're now wearing your soccer gear, you look like a soccer team, go for it, we've given you the gear. That's the liberal market individualistic approach. They're likely to get smashed because they don't know how to play soccer. Hence the social democratic approach comes in here, which would say, well, hang on a sec, we're going to work with these kids to help them understand how the game works. Because it's not just enough to give them the outfit, we need to teach them how things work so they can succeed in the game of soccer. Now, that assumes, of course, that we want to play the game of soccer and it's a good game. Now, that's the pragmatic approach. We might want to think about that in bigger picture terms of, is the game that we're playing actually the right game? This takes us to some of these other approaches. Now, they come from things like critical analysis, feminist sociology, feminist politics, etc., Indigenous politics. And they're things like the recognitive and the representative associational approaches. These come from the works of people like Nancy Fraser, Anna Yeatman, Sharon Gertz, and so forth. So the recognitive one is basically, we want to reconstitute the experience to recognise and involve those that have been marginalised. So that is things like knowledge in the sciences and mathematics, which teachers in schools push for as saying these are disadvantaging girls and women. They should have more access to maths and science, not just access, the way it's taught and the way it's constructed is disadvantaging these students. So we worked around maths and science to broaden their knowledge base to include more women and more thought from more women perspectives, and as a result, you see more women and girls succeeding in maths and science. Still not anywhere near what it should be, but it's certainly improving. And what's happened as a result is the field of maths and science have grown rather than become narrowed. Okay, so it's been a benefit to those fields. The representative and associational is more around who gets to be representative and who gets to have the right to come together as a group. So this is things like if we're writing curriculum or making decisions, who's included and who's consulted. So when you're making a school policy decision and you have a community consultation, who actually comes along? Is it the parents that are more like the teachers that feel comfortable in school? How do we engage those that don't usually come along and get represented? How do we as a school think about those people that are on the fringes that we don't see? Because they have a role in the school community and a right to be involved, but we often miss those. So that's where that sort of notion comes in. We see it in terms of who sits around the curriculum table now. We used to just have the government department and the academics. Now you'll have parents, Indigenous, women, rural and remote, low SES community representatives, etc., etc., non-English speaking background, migrant groups. So this is about being recognised as who comes together to take part. We've then got the notion of curricular justice, and I mentioned that briefly in the curriculum week. This is probably more a theoretical stance coming from Connell. You're not likely to see this enacted in any short period of time. But the notion here is that, well, if the knowledge in the way schooling is constructed in the curriculum is the knowledge of the advantaged, then only some people will ever have that knowledge. But curricular justice is saying we need to look at the process of curriculum and how it creates disadvantage. So flipping it around, for instance, and starting with the knowledge of the least advantaged, because then everyone will have the same experience, because everyone will at least have the experience of the least advantaged in many ways. So we can start there and reconstruct knowledge around that sort of framework to make it more inclusive. That relates to the notion of epistemic justice, which is knowledge in the way one knows. So how does one come to understand things? How does one experience knowledge? There's a relationship here to the feminist approaches and Indigenous knowledge perspectives, but it's basically saying, as a knower, things are different. And you've all heard me banging on about the country stuff and that plan in the country, etc. So it's that sort of notion comes into the epistemic justice. Now, what is it to live in the world that's not a metropolitan world? And how does that knowledge influence the way we think and understand the world and include that in our schooling? Spatial justice is the where things are at now. It's the sort of new theoretical ground coming from the work of someone like Soja. Sorry, epistemic, I should have said, was coming from someone like Fricker. So the spatial justice is basically saying, well, hang on, we don't just experience in the world in historical or economical ways, which tend to influence all the other approaches. We experience the world spatially. So that spatial understanding is a whole different way of seeing the world, where we live, where we move, the spaces we move through, the relationship between places. So we could say city-country relationships, inner-outer suburb city relationships, etc. So there's a spatial dimension which is beyond the economic and the historical. And that's where things are at now. If we think in terms of curriculum and schooling, curriculum is often perceived in this distributive sense. Okay, those students that don't have the knowledge of the powerful we distribute some access to that knowledge and try to help them succeed in it. Or we look at the way achievement is patterned. It's often spatially organised between the country and the city, rich suburbs to not so rich suburbs, and things are organised in those sort of spatial ways. So what we're saying with the social justice stuff is, look, pretty much every policy in education has been distributive. It might have had some influence by the representative and the recognitive, but it's led to a redistribution of resources. We need to think more about the basis upon which we distribute those things. Maybe what we're distributing isn't right. And we need to look at the way in which we understand the very nature of the distribution. Maybe there are other things going on there in terms of epistemic or spatial justice and so forth, and representative of certain groups and cultures. This again, though, is a theoretical understanding. We want you to have a bit of a theoretical toolkit so that when you're in your staff meetings, have a bit of a think about, well, what actually are we discussing here? Where's that coming from? What does that actually mean? Quickly want to go through a couple of little example and points now, just to show you some of those other issues that we've got. When we look at the national goals of schooling, for example, social justice is something that's changing in our times. You'll see here in the top one, the Adelaide Declaration, that in 99, that basically it's saying schooling should be socially just. Okay, that's the language, socially just. That wasn't the outcome I wanted. Now, what you'll then see is that in the Melbourne Declaration below, social justice has basically disappeared. Okay, you'll see like one little reference to it in a very abstract way. So the point is, we've changed the language in education policy from social justice to more like outcomes and achievement and measurement. Okay, this equity and excellence, the idea of equity and excellence. What do we mean by those terms? Especially in the ACT now that we have this consultation going on. Equity tends to be getting used as some sort of proxy for disadvantage, and excellence tends to be getting used as some proxy for achievement measures. But equity and excellence in a social justice term are problematic because it's about, well, equity in whose definition of what is equitable, and excellence as defined by whom. But that's one line of argument and debate. The other one is just the language of social justice has changed. And if you remember, social justice is a process, okay, that is no longer front and centre in Australian policy. It's more about equity, the outcome, that is front and centre. But this sort of lack of clarity has some implications. Just for argument's sake, here's something from New South Wales from 2013, pre-Gonski, redistribution of resources. And in that jurisdiction, you had categories where schools were funded based on low SES, geographic isolation, or both, and different types of schools. Primary, these are K-12 schools, these are just high schools. The logic here is that they used to talk about country schools being disadvantaged because of their location, and they would then distribute funding. But what you sort of start to see when you look closely at what schools actually get funded is that it's not actually the case that all country schools are disadvantaged because of their location. Okay, so here you have a whole lot of schools in the purple that aren't being funded because of remoteness. It's not a pure pattern. Okay, these lines should not be in this sort of shape. In particular, these schools with the green, okay, they're funding for geographic isolation, but not low SES backgrounds. So these are all schools that are geographically isolated, but not low SES. So the very existence of those schools contradicts the very basis of the policy that is then used to define rural schools as disadvantaged. Or if I look at equity categories in Year 3 using the same data, these are schools that are geographically isolated, socioeconomic background, and those that get both, and schools that are just the other ones that get nothing. The key thing in this graph is there's no organisation of the colours. If the logic of policy existed, you should have all the purple down here, followed by all the blue, followed by the green, and then all the brown ones up top. But that doesn't actually happen, as you can clearly see in that scatter plot. When we talked up here about representative and associational justice, things like the Australian curriculum come into it as discussion points. Okay, obviously there's an issue around what knowledge is involved here. So we have here an example of the history curriculum, And in the early drafts, there was this depth study across all the years of study, which was basically, as you can see, a school developed study. Schools will develop a depth study of their choice, blah, blah. Now, that was the draft. The History Teachers Association thought it was great, gives some scope for local knowledge, etc. Thought it was brilliant. But when the document went out for consultation and the feedback was collated, basically they decided to delete these school developed options. Basically, the argument was they're unnecessary. And even this is an interesting phrase here. These are unnecessary in an essential learning curriculum, according to ACARA itself. Now, this is an example of the recognitive justice, because I know, for example, when we were in meetings with people about this, in the API lands, etc., they thought this was awesome. Here was a way they could go, look, we can teach local history in local language to really get kids connected to school and see its relevance and importance. So for them, it was brilliant. Problem is, most schools don't exist in things like the API lands. They exist in cities. And the city people that are worried about achievement and where they're coming were like, what the hell are we doing with this? What are we supposed to teach? So the feedback was a bit confusing, so they got rid of it. There was no recognitive or associational justice notions coming in here about who is giving us the feedback and what is the consequence of this decision for those groups. Okay, it just wasn't a factor. It was holus bolus overall feedback. Now, last one I want to point is, though, we often talk about social justice in terms of disadvantage. But this is a really awesome book by Katie Swalwell, which I got the library to get, called Educating Activist Allies. And basically, it's about teaching social justice with the elite. And this book really changed my mind about some of these things. I think the argument that, well, we can focus on the disadvantage as much as we like, but we know historically they've been disadvantaged and that's reproduced itself again and again. So maybe we need to focus on the advantaged. Maybe we need to think about how we talk about social justice with those that are well off, because, pragmatically, they're likely to be the ones in positions of authority and power who have the ability to then make decisions to influence the lives for the better of those that are less well off than they are, rather than hoping those that are less well off get to that power position themselves. And this is a really interesting study that discusses this sort of pedagogy. What they sort of found was, with the advantage, there were different categories here. You get this meritocratic, the benevolent benefactor, the resigned, and the activist ally. And it's not the same as Judith Sachs' activist teacher. But basically, there's a notion that different perspectives of social justice exist. Some of them are a bit more pragmatic, a bit more action-oriented than others. But there is certainly a discourse that we can engage with. And by using these sort of categories, what they're getting at is, well, if we understand the way that people think about social justice, we can then work with them to change that understanding that it's not just resigned, nothing we can do about it, it's just justice exists. We can make it more of, look, injustice does exist in the activist ally sense, but we can work with it, we can try to improve it, we can work against it rather than just go, nothing we can do. Okay, what we don't want is the sort of, hey, look, some people are better than others, get over it, or the benevolent benefactor of that sort of subtle violence of, look, I'll care, but I don't really care. You know, I'll give you a few dollars and then I'll beat you on the head for it back. Now, this is just a nice little quote here that I like to finish the unit with, these two last bits. Paul Brock was an awesome educator. I was a priest for that, I think. He was in the Department of Education in New South Wales for many years and was sadly diagnosed with motor neuron disease fair bit before 2004 when he wrote this. It's an awesome little book for that sort of little bit of motivation at the end of term 3 about what we're all doing in education sometimes. It's a great little book to read in that sort of genre. But he's writing here this letter to his teachers of his 2 daughters, thinking he's not going to be around. Ironically, actually, he survived motor neuron until about 18 months ago. He sadly lost his battle, but he was still employed by the department, working in educational research in the New South Wales Department for most of that time. But I think it's a great little thing. Basically, he's saying, don't just keep them busy, actually teach them. This is someone who was intimately involved in education at the highest level of New South Wales for a long, long time. And just to finish up where we started, we've talked about a lot of issues, tutorial discussions around a whole lot of issues in education and what we can do about it and what the practical approaches are. I think if there's one thing you leave with, it's this sort of notion of, is the way things are the best we can do? The notion of, this is what we've always done in this school, so this is what we should keep doing, or things we can't change, well, we can always change. And I don't think anyone would turn around and say, education as we know it right now is the best it will ever be. Okay. Our job is to continually improve it. That might be a hard job, and it involves the coalition between teachers in the school, people like us in uni researching stuff, and governments and departments and the community. But we can always do more, because if we don't, we're only going to keep getting what we've already got. And I think we're seeing enough data and evidence to tell us that what we've got now isn't necessarily great for everyone. So if we take that thought ahead, think about what we're doing. If you change little things in your teaching which make a difference incrementally, bit by bit to students, then I'm happy that that's what we've been trying to achieve.